Alrighty, it's that time. Okay, welcome back to Sociology 100. So, today we are going to be jumping back into kind of concepts and theories, just kind of continuing to work through that first set of slides I gave you. We still have a good ways to go, so I'm going to keep working through that. Before I get started, I just wanted to give you a chance to just ask any questions you might have. You know, I know kind of seats open up here and there in the course, and then people jump in. So if anybody, you know, we're in that early phase of the course where I will still answer sort of basic questions about the textbook and such. Soon that time will pass. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them at this time. Otherwise, I will jump in and get going and all that fun stuff. Excuse me. Choking on my own tea 2 times. All right. Well, if there's no questions. Oh, I guess if you weren't here the other times, I use this app for doing Q&A, right? It's called Slido. Go to slido.com, enter that code on your laptop or scan that QR code with your phone, and it'll take you to a Q&A panel. You can type in your questions. Good times. Okay, so, all right, here's where let's go back a couple slides maybe. So we were talking about, you know, last time, just kind of setting up where the course is going. So we talked a little bit about, you know, what sociology is. Oh, there are questions. I'll get to that. Okay, let's do that. If you want to use book office hours, yes, email is great. jrb5@ualberta.ca. I don't mind you using an older edition of the textbook. 6th edition should be fine. I mean, 5th edition might be okay. I honestly have not seen a 5th edition in a long time, so I don't remember what was in it and how it might be different. You're probably okay on most things. Some examples obviously might be updated. And, you know, things like media are going to be completely different because, you know, the 5th edition is probably a good 7-8 years back, so things were quite different then. But yeah, 6th edition should be okay. I was using that one before, and I don't think the changes were too major. Car extended warranties, they're a waste of money. Okay, sorry, where was I? Yeah, so we kind of were talking a little bit about, I guess, we talked about some of our kind of early sociologists, right? The sociological imagination, thinking about, you know, how social structures, either at the micro, macro, or global level, affect, you know, personal lives, right? How the trouble people find themselves in lives, or the good things and the bad things that happen to them, how those are shaped by essentially social forces, right? Or social structures. We talked about, you know, this cat, Auguste Comte, kind of in a sense, the founder of sociology, coined the word sociology in 1838, looking to basically apply the natural sciences to the study of society, right? And then Herbert Spencer, right, who, you know, kind of thought societies evolve the way that organisms evolve. And so he thought, obviously, English society was the most evolved, and that we should try and bring other people, other places in the world up to the same standard, like evolve their societies. And, you know, kind of accidentally fathered things like the eugenics movement, which said, okay, we should really kind of get rid of those people who aren't contributing socially. An idea known as social Darwinism. Yeah, I guess we just sort of, left off on a couple of things, you know, suggesting that, you know, sociology is always interested in its belief in the importance of studying society, of trying to make an ideal society out of what we learn from it, right? Trying to reshape society, but always with this tension that we know that in the past, when we've tried this, things have gone pretty substantially wrong. Okay, I think the last slide we looked at was this one, and this is Christian Smith's assessment of where sociology stands today. And he sees it really as, now it's become this thing rooted in, the emancipation, equality, and moral affirmation of all human beings as autonomous, self-directing agents, individual agents, who should be free to live their lives however they choose. Okay. So that brings us to a little bit like concretizing the field and kind of looking at where it kind of comes from historically and the ideas that have really shaped it. So basically, when we're doing sociology, for the most part, right, most people are starting from theories and then kind of working back and trying to prove those theories or find evidence to back up those theories, right? So theories, generally we can kind of class them in two ways. We can have kind of our grand theories. And grand theories are basically these theories that try to encapsulate as much of in sociology, the social world as possible, right? Try to give as big an explanation of why society is the way it is as possible, right? So, I mean, something like conflict theory or Marxism starts off with the presumption, right out of Marx, that all of human history is basically the result of class conflict, right? So conflict between different classes of people for control and power. And that sort of the whole theory of kind of conflict theory or Marxism is built around this basic notion, right? And that's supposed to explain all social action at the end of the day. Okay, there's other kind of sociological theories as well that are big. We'll talk about functionalism from Emile Durkheim, symbolic interactionism, and a few others as we go through this part, and then we'll come back to them all throughout the semester to see what they say about certain topics. Yeah, there's also what's sometimes called middle range theories, and middle range theories are usually more contained, right? They would be more trying to understand specific phenomena. So you generate a theory about a part of society and say why you think, this particular thing is happening. So you might, want to explain why, millennials and Generation Z or Z are less likely to be kind of religiously engaged, more likely to identify as nothing in particular religiously, and you would come up with a theory that explains that particular phenomenon, and that would be a middle range theory, right? Because it's not meant to explain the whole social world, it's just meant to explain a kind of set of social phenomenon. And yeah, sociological ideas generally expressed, through theories or as theory in the form of theories, and mostly they draw on a few big kind of theoretical traditions, which we'll talk about until you're sick of it, to be honest. Research, right? So research in sociology can take a lot of different forms, and we're going to talk in the next unit about how we actually do social research. And there's sort of ways that you do it numerically, right, and with statistics called quantitative research, and ways that you do it more to get at people's personal experience called qualitative research. Quantity, you're measuring quantities. Qualitative, you're measuring the quality of something. But yeah, basically, research is just the process of systematically observing reality and trying to assess the validity of theories. And either you can do this, through stats, or you can do it through talking to people and seeing if their experiences line up with a theory. Yeah, generally, we conduct research to try and figure out whether, these theories are correct, whether we can support, the things we are saying, and all that kind of stuff, right? So like anybody else. And here's where, at least sociology wants to kind of mirror the natural sciences, right? It wants to say, hey, we do research just like biologists and physicists and chemists do to try and understand the world, right? In this case, the social world, but nevertheless, we do research to validate theories in the same way as science does. Okay, values. Values is always the tricky one when it comes to social research, because nobody, comes into doing social research from a completely objective point of view, right? Basically, everybody comes in to, doing sociology. Sorry, I had a random thought which caused me to laugh. There was a while ago, I think when Stephen Harper was prime minister, he said something, we don't need to commit sociology. And no, I never understood what that meant, but people put up posters of him pointing and saying, commit sociology, and that flashed in my brain, and it made me laugh. I don't know why, because committing sociology sounds bad. Okay, so yeah, we come in with like ideas about what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, and values basically often help shape the kind of research people want to do, right? It shapes how they do their research, what they think is important. Everybody comes into social research with values, right? Like if you look at a lot of my colleagues, especially say in criminology, right? They come, with a set of values typically that's very much looking at, say, the prison system as something that is fraught with problems, that is particularly oppressive, especially of certain groups, right? The poor, indigenous people, people of color. And through those values, a lot of their research is shaped, right? They frame the research in certain ways because of it. They do the research they do because they think these questions are important, and their understanding of the world is fundamentally shaped by what they believe, right? So values, what you think is important, what you think is right and wrong, is going to shape strongly what you do. And that's, I guess, probably pretty obvious. Did I give that enough time to yeah, okay. So, what does the sociological perspective actually kind of look like, right? So what can we learn by as Harper would say, committing sociology? How can this kind of illuminate the world? Well, one particular phenomenon that's been studied a lot by sociologists, and really going back to the beginning of the field, is suicide, right? So, if you go back to basically the beginning of the end of the 19th century, so late 1800s, when a guy, we'll talk about him in a minute, called Emile Durkheim, one of the kind of early sociologists, wanted to better understand why people commit suicide, right? And so basically he sort of took a sociological lens, and he's reacting in a sense to the way that suicide was understood at the time, right? Suicide was seen, and I think in a lot of ways still is seen, as an antisocial act, right? Something non-social, right? Entirely contained to the individual, right? It was something that they were doing to themselves out of the context of bigger social groups. It was a perfectly individualistic act, right? So, when people would think about suicide, and I think this is still the case largely, they often wondered what was happening inside the mind of the person who took their own life, basically why that person made that choice, rather than looking at, say, the social factors that might have contributed to someone, seeking to do that to themselves. So what Durkheim did is he sort of instead tried to understand suicide socially, to see, what were the hidden social causes of suicide. And it remains, one of, I think, the more fascinating kind of pieces of sociology, in the sense, too, that it's held up really, really well over time, right? So Durkheim, again, he's doing this at the end of the 19th century. So now, over a century ago, and kind of thinking about, suicide. And most of his kind of basic assertions about it have sort of held up, right? There's been, kind of cracks here and there in some of the specifics, but overall his theory sort of holds up. And when we kind of re-examine it, and do follow-up studies, a century later, we still find kind of similar things. Okay, so what did Emile Durkheim do? Well, Emile Durkheim basically, trying to understand suicide, gathered as many kind of records in Prussia, or like basically Germany, as he could, trying to kind of understand, like looking at who committed suicide, what were their characteristics, and what do we know about them? And so kind of put all of these statistics together and tried to kind of figure out what patterns we could see and what that might tell us about the social dimensions of suicide, right? So one of the kind of assumptions, especially kind of as psychology was starting to gain its kind of footing as a discipline, was that, suicide would increase as rates of basically mental disorders increase, right? So the people who had more mental disorders would be more likely to take their own lives, right? Now, what Durkheim actually found was that rates of psychological disorders actually didn't kind of correspond directly, right? So basically you would expect, like, as people report more psychological disorders, you would see an increase in suicide. And that actually wasn't the case in the kind of context he was looking at it, right? In fact, as you found people with more what were classified as mental disorders, you actually saw rates of suicide actually decline. Now, sorry, I forget what's on my next slide. I just want to make sure I'm not... yeah, okay. That's the right slide. I'm like, is all this just in my head? I can't remember. So what he actually found was that suicide rates varied based on differences in the degree of social solidarity in different categories of the population. So what did he actually find? So, I mean, again, he's looking at kind of 19th century Germany. And so he had people kind of classified particularly by religious group. And what he found was that people who were Jewish, and it's a relatively small community, reported the highest rates of mental disorders, right? So they had the most kind of psychological distress. Not surprising, given that it was a particularly kind of anti-Semitic culture, right? People who were Jewish would probably feel kind of put upon by society. That sort of makes sense. But inversely to what you might expect, was that actually people who were Jewish reported the fewest suicides, right? And then it was like Roman Catholics, next down the list. And then from there, it was Protestants, and then, so it was like basically people who were Jewish committed suicide the least, then Catholics, second least, then Protestants, and then people who identified as non-religious committed suicide the most. Okay, so basically Durkheim tries to figure out, what does this mean, right? Why does it look this way? Because like when we're looking at, Protestants and atheists, they reported the fewest mental disorders, but the highest rates of taking their own lives. So what Durkheim comes up with is this idea of social solidarity, right? One of the things that he kind of noticed about people who are Jewish is that they had very tight, very interconnected communities where they saw each other a lot, they interacted with each other on a nearly daily basis, and they had really, really strong social bonds, right? So they all knew each other, they were all connected to each other, they all talked to each other, right? Deeply connected kind of communities. They, attended religious services together. It's a very small community, so it was very tightly bound, right? They tended to do business at each other's businesses, right? Because a lot of times the broader society wouldn't deal with them, and they had dietary restrictions, so they had to keep kosher. So they tended to live in small areas, buy products from each other's businesses, and so on and so forth. And he suggested that, they felt put upon by society, and that caused them a lot of psychological distress. It was the social qualities that kept them from taking their own lives, right? Because they're so deeply entwined in social units that they're less likely to take their own lives because they see the social connections and how it's going to affect everyone else. They feel very bound in those communities. And as you went through different groups, right, people tended to get less and less connected, in this case based on religious practices, because Jews had very demanding religious practices, Catholics had somewhat less, but still quite demanding religious practices, Protestants had the least of the religious people, and then atheists had really no religious practices, and so they were more kind of socially unbound, right? They had weak social solidarity, they were weakly connected to people in their groups. Sorry, I think my daughter is texting me. Why? Oh, I'll answer her later. Okay, there's nothing critical. Okay, so social solidarity, right, basically refers to the degree to which group members share beliefs and values, and the intensity, and really importantly for Durkheim's theory of suicide, the intensity of their kind of bonds and intensity and frequency of their interactions and how tightly bound they are, right? And the more tightly bound they were to other people, the less likely they were to take their own lives. Okay, so I said, and that's basically his thesis, and it's basically held up pretty well. In kind of repeated studies, we still find really similar patterns, right? people who are deeply religious and deeply tied into religious communities where they attend frequently, where lots of people know them, have very, very low suicide rates. And what we've seen is, as in particular, social bonds and the kind of normal social bonds that people used to have, particularly in things like clubs, political parties, religious services or religion, have sort of broken down in the post-1960s period, when people moved into the suburbs and away from communities that were kind of ethnically or religiously bound. We've seen a broad increase in the rates of suicide, particularly amongst young people. And I don't know if I'll talk about it in this class, but if you come and take sociology of youth with me, at another point, which is SOS 377, I talk a whole bunch about how what we see now in kind of, the pre and post-COVID kind of landscape, especially with Gen Z, is a massive increase in two things: loneliness, right, or a lack of social solidarity in young people, and increases in self-harm of all kinds, right, including suicide. And this is all driven, I think the consensus is maybe not 100%, but pretty close, that as people have disconnected more from each other, more of their lives have shifted into like these atomized little pods. You live in your house in the suburbs. You're not surrounded by a lot of friends or communities. Your relationships are mostly online. That basically, this has broken down social solidarity, and it's made, for a lot of psychological distress leading to self-harm and suicide, especially in young people, right? So there's lots of causes. I don't want to say it's all social media, except it's all social media. It's TikTok's fault. I'm going to just say it. No, I'm kidding. It's also Instagram's fault. But yeah, it's a terrible joke. I'm sorry. It's also Facebook's fault. And Facebook owns Instagram, and Facebook is evil. So yeah, let's just leave it there. Also, probably X's fault. It's such a stupid name. For such a smart guy, he sure does some dumb stuff. Anyway, right, as we've kind of had a breakdown in all sorts of social bonds for young people since the early 1960s, right, no religion, or less religion, much less religion. Youth unemployment tended to be double digits in Canada, other places even higher. Less adult experience, especially as both parents have started working outside of the home, and just like fewer communities that young people are a part of. We've seen, they have less social solidarity, and, rates of distress have gone up considerably. Okay. Okay, that's a good question. For Durkheim's study, would it be reasonable to argue that lower suicide rates might, in more tight-knit religious groups, could have been affected by other factors such as increased social pressure to avoid suicide? Right, but that is social solidarity, right? If there's social pressures that can lead you to avoid suicide, right, because you're tightly knit in the community, they have a strong hold on you, you know how it's going to affect them, right? You have a religious belief that you're all tied into because you're all part of this community that shares the same beliefs. That is social solidarity, right? Religious beliefs are part of social solidarity and sharing it. It's all kind of part of it. Okay. I think, what did I do? How did I do that? I didn't mean to do that. There we go. I'm back. Okay. Increase in social pressure, intimidation. Those are all, in a sense, part of social solidarity, right? Binding in, afraid that you may miss out on the afterlife that all your family and friends, that's all kind of part of social solidarity, right? It's really strong. Okay. Instagram Reels greater than TikTok, if you say so. You know what's even greater? Dostoevsky. Or, Shakespeare. Greater than both those things. Read a book. I'll sit there. You could choose mind-numbing rot or, a book. Not to put too fine a point on it, I'm not a big fan of TikTok or Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts or any other, things that reduce your attention span to 18 seconds. Okay, is there a difference between antisocial and non-social behavior? So antisocial, would be typically like aimed against a group, right? So someone who's like especially a young person who's antisocial would seek to sort of alienate themselves from a group, right? Go against the norms of a group. Non-social behavior would be behavior that's entirely individualistic, right? That it's only one kind of person encapsulated as an individual, having no reference to anything. Isn't there a name for them on Facebook? Sorry, it's like Facebook garbage. I don't know. Yeah. What's that? Propaganda. Okay, now sorry, I led to this by being silly. This is my fault. It's the Subway, sir. See, I've sometimes, to just be honest, I've thought about seeing if I could like strike a brand partnership for my classes and just like do a live read in the middle of class. It's like, this class is brought to you by Raycons. Don't want to listen to the professor? Put in those Raycon earbuds. No, I'm kidding. That's like, could I make some extra cash on the side by brand placement in class? And how fast would I get fired? I'm not sure what the universities, they don't have an explicit policy, which I suspect means no one's ever tried it before. Not that it would turn out well, but no one's ever tried it. Okay. The first of our big theories, brought to you by Frosted Flakes. No, I'm kidding. Functionalism, right? Sometimes also referred to as structural functionalism. Basically, right, and this is Durkheim. So I was just talking about Durkheim, so let's talk about Durkheim's kind of ideas and the school of thought that emerges from Durkheim's kind of way of understanding the social world, right? Basically, functionalism says that basically human behavior, right, and all of human life is governed by stable patterns of social relations. These are our social structures, right? So we talked about these last class, right? You've got face-to-face interactions, institutional interactions, or interactions of the individual with institutions and moving through institutions, and then kind of global structures, right? So basically, Durkheim is mostly interested in kind of the relationship of individuals to those big social institutions or kind of macro structures, and how social structures either maintain or undermine social stability, right? So there's a really strong kind of thought in functionalism that a society that's functioning well is kind of in equilibrium, right? You might think of it in almost biological terms as something like homeostasis, right? Like if everything is working, well in a society, it's like a human body, right, or an animal's body, right? All the organs are functioning well, right? The creature is in good health. Now, when you see, something go wrong, right? When something in society gets out of whack, right? People are no longer happy. Their lives are kind of spiraling. Social structures I guess social structures still exist, but they stop serving people and social disorder kind of follows. Basically, what functionalism says is that the balance has been broken, right? You have an institution or a social structure that goes from function, right? Functionalism, function, to dysfunction, right? And the same way that, if a human body has, say, a kidney that is no longer working, right? It is dysfunctional. The whole organism suddenly, doesn't seem to work well anymore. It's the same kind of idea in functionalism, right? So yeah, I mean, basically functionalism, it says these social structures, they've been built by people over time, right? They kind of emerge naturally out of society to serve the needs of society, right? And they come out of, shared values and preferences in that society. And then what'll happen, from time to time is things stop working, right? Something gets to be in dysfunction. So let's say, I don't know, the police, right? So the police is a particular, I don't want to get ahead of myself. Okay, I'll just say it very quickly because I don't want to jump too far ahead because Parsons has some stuff to say about institutions. But, the police have a particular function in society, right? They're a social institution that is essentially meant to defend society from internal threats, right? from threats to the social order from inside of it, right? So the police are there to, bring people back into line, to keep the laws, which are just in functionalism, the shared values of that society, and make sure everybody's following the rules, right? But theoretically, something like the police can fall into dysfunction, right? The police start to abuse their power, right? They start to target particular groups in society. They start to take bribes from the criminal element, right? And then they become corrupted, and they serve one particular social class over another, right? They serve the wealthy over the middle class or the working class. And these are all kinds of dysfunctions that can happen in a social structure like the police, right? And then suddenly people stop trusting the police, people stop calling the police, people potentially stop following the rules because they stop believing in them, right? Because they're being enforced by this oppressive institution. So for a functionalist, right, if you ever find that something isn't working in society, the solution to that then becomes to try and reestablish that equilibrium, right? So it might be time for, a reform. Like you would reform the police. I don't know, you bring in a new police chief who has the focus on rooting out corruption, or, maybe defund the police, or whatever you want it to be, right? But basically, when you see a dysfunction caused by a social structure, kind of like if you saw a diseased kidney, you would either try to treat it with medicine or remove it from the body, right? An imperfect metaphor, but hopefully that makes sense. Okay, no questions. Very nice. Okay, so like I said, Durkheim was sort of the first proponent of this particular school of sociology, and he's one of the first kind of people, essentially working in the field in a considered way. And, we'll talk more about Durkheim because he has something to say on almost every subject. Wrote a lot of really important early texts in sociology, the elements of religion, on suicide, and many, many others that people still read today. Like if you do a master's in sociology, good chance or even if you take classical social theory, there's a good chance you're going to read at least some Durkheim. Usually elements of religion is the one people choose, but there's lots of other ones. Okay, now what happens obviously is then other people come and start to work with Durkheim. And one of these people is Talcott Parsons. So Talcott Parsons is an American, right? And basically the way it kind of worked, and he basically does most of his work in the mid part of the 20th century. From kind of like the 1940s till the 1980s-ish. And basically what happened was Parsons went off and he wanted to study basically sociology. There wasn't any sociology schools in America at the time, and the most established and prestigious ones were all in Europe. So Parsons goes off to Europe to earn his PhD, and then comes back to the United States and where he basically studies under Durkheim, and then under people who worked with Durkheim, and then comes back to the United States and sort of starts doing functionalist sociology in North America, right? And he's one of the first to introduce this school of sociology to the North American context. Okay, so Parsons kind of takes a beat off of Durkheim, right? And kind of builds on what Durkheim was talking about, right? So basically, Parsons, looks at society very much in a functionalist way, right? And he says, various institutions need to work to ensure the smooth operation of a society, and that every institution basically has its sort of function, right? They each do a different thing in society, and it's only when they're all kind of doing it well that you have a harmonious society. When society becomes less harmonious, it's because something is going wrong, right? Okay, so some of the examples that Parsons gives in terms of what institutions do, right? Family. So family being sort of the, I guess the little platoon, or like one of the smallest units in society, but one of the most important ones. Families have a couple of social functions. So first, they, obviously give birth to the next generation of people, and they raise those people, right? So, and in the raising of them, right, in this function of socialization, they teach people how to be in society, right? People learn most of their social skills and most of what they know about the social world, typically in their families. So family is a very, very important, very central kind of social institution, even though it tends to be quite small on an individual level. And then, like, there's all sorts of institutions in society, right? You could list these endlessly, and in some of his works, Parsons does, right? Kind of trying to catalog everything. But there's things like the military, right? The military exists to defend a society against external threats. Police exists to defend the society against internal threats. The economy exists, and economic institutions exist to, allow people to make a living and subsist and support themselves. Schools, right? And especially in the kind of context of the post-industrial revolution world, right? So really in the 19th and 20th centuries, schools increasingly are there to do a couple of things. One is teach people the basic skills that they're going to need to get by in the economy, right? So, reading, writing, and arithmetic, kind of basic skills. And, some would argue, especially later on, the ability to follow authority, right? So that you can be a good, say, factory worker, because schools as we think of them are really founded in the factory era, and listen to your boss on the assembly line, right? Like you listen to your teacher. So there's a bit of a preparation. And to teach values. And especially this becomes true with the rise of the nation state, right? And especially once you get places like the United States and Canada that are a mix of people from all over the place, schools become a place to instill things like the value of nationalism or, American identity or Canadian identity in people, right? So you teach skills and you instill common values in the society, especially when a society is like multicultural or heterogeneous. You need common values so that society all kind of works. And then religion for Parsons helps people establish a shared moral code and the kind of boundaries within you should follow that shared moral code. Okay. Just going to jump back. Okay, still no questions. Okay. So another person, this time someone who, both studies in Europe and works a little bit with Talcott Parsons, is a character named Robert Merton, right? Another North American sociologist. And Merton is particularly Merton's known for a lot of things. And when we get to crime and deviance, we'll talk about strain theory, which is his theory of why people commit crimes. But basically, when it comes to kind of the basics of functionalism, right, what social structures do, so he'll suggest, obviously, right, social structures have consequences for different groups of people. And some might not be good, right? Some might be dysfunctional, right? Some might screw up people's lives. And part of this comes from the fact that what Merton identifies is that social structures or social institutions can have one of two kind of functions, according to him. Manifest functions and latent functions, right? So manifest functions, right, are basically the obvious and intended effects of a social structure. So say the manifest function of school, for instance, is to, educate young people, give them the skills they need to function in the economy, and to instill in them some set of common values, right? Those would be the kind of obvious, like that's what, when people think about what school is there to do, right? That's what school is meant to do, and that's what it's intended to do. But then there are always kind of latent functions, sometimes non-obvious and unintended effects of social structures. So if you take, again, the example of the school, the public school, one of the things it does is it jams a bunch of young people of roughly the same ages into a confined space where they vastly outnumber the adults that are able to supervise them. And so there's a couple of kind of latent functions that can happen. For one, you often generate youth subcultures, right? So basically you put a whole bunch of young people together, they develop things like their own language, in a sense, right? Not entirely, but lingos and slang of their own styles of dress, their own cultural patterns of consumption that differ from the adults. And nobody really intended this to happen, but it happens as a result of, putting a bunch of young people together. Okay, same thing with university, right? Or colleges. The manifest function is obvious, right? Educate people in, whatever it is they choose to pursue. Latent functions, like one of the weird latent functions that often happens in university in particular, and this has been the case for a century. We kind of catalog it. Is it? Am I out of time? No, I'm kidding. I joke. That's the same alarm I have to wake me up in the morning. So, and maybe this is all a terrible dream. It's certainly hot in here. Maybe I'm in hell. Who knows? Or maybe you're in hell. Who knows? No, trust us. We're in hell. All right, university, right? One of the things that it does is it tends to facilitate what's called assortive mating, which basically sorts people. You meet people often that you're going to engage in romantic relationships with, and often, until really recently, and it changed sort of with the tail end of the millennials, people that you might be interested in marrying. I don't say that because millennials don't really get married, neither does Gen Z. But that's a discussion for another time. But basically, it was a place where people would meet people, form romantic partnerships, and maybe, then transition into marriage, right? And that was no one was ever like, let's establish a university where people can date, because that would be stupid. But it sort of was a function of that. It also tended to solidify social class, right? One of the latent functions of universities was that it got a whole bunch of people that were mostly kind of middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy all into one space, and they all got to get married to each other, engage in romantic relationships, form friendships, and leave all of the people who were working class and poor out, so that those people, had their own places to gather. And basically it consolidated kind of particular classes within a sort of social elite or a higher social strata. And that was not something that people were like, the university should keep poor people poor forever. Hopefully, no one said that. But it sort of is one of the things that it does, right? Is it puts people from higher socioeconomic classes in the same space, right? And then they meet and they mingle and they marry and they have children and they stay together and they don't mix with other classes. Okay. I should have had a question slide there. We're still okay. We got 8 minutes. Should we start on conflict theory? Yeah, fine. This is Marx, and I hate Marx. So we'll do what we can. All right, conflict theory. Conflict theory largely comes from, starts with Karl Marx. It's called conflict theory specifically because it focuses on conflict between groups, right? So at its kind of very early stages, conflict theory, Marx has it in the first lines of the Communist Manifesto, that all history hitherto written is the history of class struggle, right? It was a conflict between basically different classes through history. So Marx goes back to like the Romans. He's like, it was between the master and the slave. It was between then the feudal lord and the serf. And now it is between the proletariat, the working class, and the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, right? So basically conflict theory, why it's called conflict theory, is because in its various iterations, and we'll talk about how it gets picked up by like feminists and racial scholars, is always about the struggle between two kind of groups, typically, well, always, an oppressor and an oppressed, right? Okay, so focuses on macro level structures, big stuff. Like Marx was always focused on the economy, right? Marx believed that all the kind of oppression or conflict that existed in human history was all economic in nature, right? It was in how things were made and who benefited most from what was made, right? So in the Roman era, between the slaves and their masters, right? The slaves did all the labor, the masters got all the benefit. In the feudal period, right, the serfs grew just enough food to barely eke out a living, and then passed on anything extra to the feudal lords and then to the king. So it kept them they made everything, and yet they had nothing at the end of the day. And the people who didn't work the land got everything. And the same in kind of the industrial period. The proletariat, right, the working class, works in the factories. They make everything which the capitalist then gets to sell for a profit. They get to keep the profit, and you only get to keep a wage that barely keeps you alive. And basically, conflict theorists will suggest that society sort of careens between two major kind of poles, right? It's always unequal, but these patterns of inequality produce either social stability in some circumstances or social change in others, right? And so Marx was really focused especially on, how these transitions between ways of making things overthrew older orders, right? And of course, his big prediction in the Communist Manifesto was that what would happen with the working class, or the proletariat, as he called them, is they would eventually realize that they're getting, basically screwed out of all of the surplus value they were creating through their work, that the owners of the means of production were pocketing and living, high on the hog. They would get sick of this. They would overthrow the bourgeoisie and take control of the means of production itself. Now, this never happens for lots of reasons, but that's sort of what Marx thought, right? I always thought, interested in this question of, okay, how is the social order being maintained? And then what happens, what needs to happen so that it gets overthrown, right? How do we produce stability in sometimes and change in others, right? And I mean, one of the big things that's also in Marxism or conflict theory is a notion that, members of the privileged class will always seek to maintain their advantage, right? They'll always seek, I should slow down in my speaking, to keep the classes on which their prosperity is built subordinate, right? So they want to be in power, they want to control everything in society, and keep other groups kind of down. So you always have, oppressor and oppressed in some way. Elimination of privilege will lower the level of conflict in society and lead to more human welfare. This is why typically conflict theorists are either socialists economically or communists in some way, shape, or form, right? Because they believe that inequality is the big bugaboo, and so you have to reduce inequality to make a better society. Okay. Non-social would be, did these just not show up before? It's possible. I will say, all right, you're all leaving. Maybe I'll answer these next time, since we're already packing up. As soon as I look down, half the class is gone. All right, we'll finish. Well, I'll answer these questions next time. I'll answer these questions next time. We'll leave it at that for today, and we'll come back to conflict theory on Wednesday.